be. So this is a very typical question of policies for market failure, and we will need to explain the given policy along with another policy that can correct market failure. To get the full credit, the explanations must be contextualized to the given market. For this question, because it's a higher order question, we must also define some criteria for evaluation, which we generally tend to use the FEAST framework to compare across the identified policies. Through this evaluation, we can identify the best policy to resolve the given market failure. So now let's look at question analysis. So the command word here is discuss. So discuss actually entails multiple perspectives, and we also have the word best here. So this leans towards the idea of how we need to rank and look at criteria to base our ranking. With this, we can then start to think about the idea of pros and cons of each policy. So in terms of content, what we need to do is that we need to explain the government policies. Firstly, the given government policy of Compulsory Education Act, regulation, as well as another policy which we can choose, maybe subsidy, perhaps public education. We just need to choose another alternative policy and explain both in depth. So in terms of the approach, what we need to do is that we will need to have our R1, R2, E1, and E2. In this case, our R1 will be the mechanism of the policy, how it works, how it achieves QS, as well as some form of pros, especially for the given policy. In terms of our evaluation, we need to use FEAST to explain how there could be certain shortcomings with each policy. So R1 is the given policy, R2 is the chosen policy that we have used as an alternative. So now we have our essay outline. So we have our intro, body, and conclusion. So in our introduction, we give a brief overview of the policies we are comparing, as well as the criteria that we have chosen from using FEAST. We must then explain each policy, plus evaluate each of the policies as our R1, E1, R2, E2. Lastly, in our conclusion, we need to give our stand, substantiate our stand, and we can also use something special, which in this case will be some form of recommendation. Diving deeper into the intro, as you can see, we give an overview of the policies, and we also identify which parts of our FEAST framework we are using. So we choose either 2 or 3 criteria using the FEAST framework to compare across the policies. So we framework our answer based on the introduction. So now we must explain the first requirement. Most important thing I would like you guys to take note is that we must explain the mechanism of each policy. So firstly, let's identify the policy. The policy is the Compulsory Education Act, and it serves as a form of regulation. Next, what you need to do is that you need to contextualize the policy to the SG context. This is extremely important, especially if you want to get an analytical answer or an L3 answer. Lastly, what I would like you guys to take note is that when we explain the mechanism of the policy, right, we need to show how the policy works to reach QS. So this is extremely important. If you do not show this, your answer will be severely lacking in economic analysis and will be deemed quite a weak answer if you don't show how the policy actually serves to reach QS. We must then identify a few advantages, such as our effectiveness as well as our feasibility. So we look at the effectiveness of our regulation. So in terms of regulation, there is a certain level of certainty in the outcome to achieve QS. So we use that to say, okay, so this is a very effective policy. We also show that it is feasible because the cost of implementation could be deemed not as high as other policies like direct provision or public education. Now we look at our evaluation. We look at the disadvantages. So let's use our FEAST framework. We can see that the Act may not be feasible due to the idea of imperfect information, which can lead to further market failure because we are not able to have accurate information about the socially optimal output of QS. So we could over or underestimate QS because of this imperfect information. So in the end, the quantity that the government actually stipulates is not at QS. It could be more, it could be less, and it does not resolve this market failure. Similarly, it could be ineffective, the policy, because if the population refuses to comply, the effectiveness is much hindered. Lastly, we can look at whether it helps to target the root cause. So we have identified in question A that there are 2 causes of market failure. In this case, the regulation does not address the root cause of imperfect information directly, so that's why it could be deemed as a con. Similarly here, we must explain the mechanism of public education. So firstly, we must explain how public education can actually correct imperfect information. We manage QS firstly by moving MPB perceived to MPB actual. So what does this do is that it actually moves MPB perceived closer to MPB actual. So where MPB perceived cuts MPC, it is now closer or at QS. Additionally, it also helps to internalize MEB as it increases consumption and shifts MPB closer to MSB, thus reducing dead weight loss and mitigating the market failure. So take note here that we are still explaining the mechanism of how QS is being achieved because we are bringing our MPB closer to MSB, either by bringing MPB closer to MPB actual, which is our MSB, or just bringing MPB closer to MSB and helping to internalize the positive externalities. So this is the economic analysis needed. A diagram too can be drawn here using our normal public education diagram, showing how our MPB perceived is actually moving closer and being brought towards our MPB actual. So a diagram here will be good. You can use it in tandem with this explanation. Now we use feast to show some advantage of public education. So firstly, we use the idea of it addressing the root cause because public education targets the imperfect information very, very directly. It is very appropriate in addressing this root cause as it seeks to educate the public about the true benefits of education. Next up, we use the framework of fees to actually show the disadvantages of public education. So, public education generally tends to have two main issues. One is the idea of the uncertainty of the population being willing to be educated. And secondly, it is the time required to change habits and behaviors. It's a bit difficult to change the habits of people. It also takes a long time to change their behavior. So these are the two general disadvantages of public education. Lastly, as an optional R3, or if you decide to use subsidy as your alternative policy, let's show how we can explain the mechanism of subsidy. So we explain the mechanism of subsidy and how it achieves QS here. By having a subsidy equals to MEB, it actually lowers cost of production and actually shifts MPC to MPC star. So there is an internalization of the positive externality. So take note here, we are again showing how the MPC shifts and we show that there is a subsidy that is equivalent to the MEB, and we show how QS is actually achieved in the market. So your MPC star will intersect MPB at QS, and in this case, QS is achieved, allocation efficiency is restored in the market, and the dead weight loss is eliminated. We also then contextualize based on the question. So take note, to get the level 3 answer, the top answer, we need to contextualize based on the question. So we need to give examples of educational subsidies in Singapore. So for example, we have our subsidized fees. Our primary school fees are heavily subsidized, secondary school fees are heavily subsidized, we have so many EduSave subsidies, etc. So that's the thing, we can actually tap into our own knowledge and contextualize our answer based on the question given. We then use fees to evaluate our requirement 3 here. So subsidies are appropriate in addressing the root cause of positive externality because subsidies is equivalent to MEB. So in this case, because it's equivalent to MEB, it's actually directly targeting the issue of positive externality. However, the issue here is that due to imperfect information, the government could overall underestimate the MEB at QS. So there could still be market failure in here. There could still be either an over or under consumption due to the estimation of our MEB that is inaccurate. Subsidies may also not be very feasible due to it costing a lot to the government. Lastly, it does not target imperfect information. It only mainly targets positive externality, so it does not address this other root cause of our market failure. So lastly, now we can talk about our conclusion. So for our conclusion, what we should do is we should compare across policies and actually state our stand. And our stand here must directly answer the question. So we directly answer the question. We tell the examiner that we choose the Compulsory Education Act as the best policy. So we agree with the question due to the situation given. So at the start, we already identified a few criteria. So now we need to make sure that we substantiate our stand. So firstly, we talk about effectiveness from feast, and we say that in the given situation. In the given situation, the regulation is superior because of the certainty of the effects. So this gives it an advantage compared to the other policies because it is very certain that we are able to get a certain quantity, which in this case hopefully is QS. Next up, we can talk about the impact on stakeholders. So the stakeholder that we are concerned about right now is the government, because the government is the one that is enacting the policy. So what is important here is that we must look at the cost of implementation. So we have already established from the start that we say that compulsory education is actually not as expensive as other policies. So we can say that it may cost less compared to other policies. However, even after saying that, okay, we choose one as the best policy, we can go further and beyond. We can give out something special. So, our something special here is a recommendation. So, we can actually recommend, okay, to do a two-prong approach. Okay, so this two-prong approach is that we choose both, okay, this regulation as well as public education. Because remember, at the start at A, what did we say? There are two different causes of market failure. And we also know that one of our policies is a more of a short-term policy, more for what we have in the short term, which is our regulation. On the other hand, public education takes some time, but then it's a long-term kind of policy. So what happens if we use a combination of the two is that we are able to firstly both target our positive externalities as well as our imperfect information, because public education directly targets imperfect information. Compulsory Education Act helps to target our positive externalities. On the other hand, okay, this could also mean that we have both a short run and long run solution to the market failure at hand. Looking at our mark scheme, we can actually identify the level of rigor needed to score well. So take note for L3, which is what we all want to get, is that we need excellent analytical explanations and the contextualization is needed to get L3. So firstly, we need to make sure that in this case, more specifically for our policies, when we explain the mechanism, how do we get this highest level is that we need to make sure that we explain how QS is achieved. We need to explain what shifts, the MPB shifts, from MPB perceived to MPB actual, or perhaps we bridge some sort of information gap, or perhaps what we do is that we subsidize such that MPC shifts, such that when MPC cuts MPB, we get QS. So we need to explicitly explain to the examiner how exactly QS is being achieved. So these theories, these principles, these economic concepts has to be explicitly explained. It has to be precise, it has to be logical, and it has to be reasoned in its explanation. Additionally, okay, diagrams are needed to make sure that you get your full mark. So subsidy diagram is something that is important. Something that I would recommend also is drawing your public education diagram. So you see the difference between L3 and L2. L2, you can have everything. You rehearse the answers, you copy the answers. But what separates that is actually your contextualization. So you need to make sure that your response is contextualized. So two things to focus on. Firstly, you need to ensure that you explain your mechanism. You must explain your QS being achieved, how it's being achieved by the policy. Secondly, contextualize it according to our context here. So it's about education in Singapore. So we need Singapore, we need education. Here, to get the evaluation marks, your usage of feast to evaluate each policy must be well explained. The summative conclusion must also be well justified and be based on your criteria set out at the start. So introduction is important because it actually sets the tone for the rest of our essays. And once we establish everything in the introduction, everything should flow through nicely. So for your evaluation, link it back to your criteria that you have stated out at the start. For your evaluation, make sure that you really target your R1 and your R2 with your evaluation. So evaluative judgments must be well linked to your essay. It cannot be something that stands alone.